So, hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Book Café Podcast. I'm your host, Omar Nizam, and in today's episode, we will be talking about this book right here entitled The Synoptic Problem, A Way Through the Maze by Professor Dr. Mark Goodacre. And I'm extremely thrilled to have the author himself in today's episode to talk about the book. But just before that, if you are watching this episode on YouTube, do please be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon. It really helps us out. And if you are listening to this on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or Spotify, do please continue to download and support the show because we are going to have a lot more content added very soon. And in fact, it's very fair to say that we have new content added all the time. But as far as this episode goes, let me first do my due diligence by welcoming the author himself, Professor Dr. Mark Goodacre. So, hi, Professor. Welcome to Book Café Podcast.
Hello, Omar. It's great to be with you and great to be with everybody else. So that I just reached on the shelf, guys. That's the physical copy of the book.
Okay, awesome. All right, awesome. So as I like to tell my viewers and listeners, one of the things that we always struggle with in our part of the world is access to the scholarly books that you guys have in the States. But luckily, thank goodness for Amazon Kindle and the Google Play Store. So we're able to just pretty much download an e-version of whatever book that we're interested in reading. So Professor, we will of course get to talking about your book in just a moment. But before that, we here at Book Cafe Podcast love to know about our authors as just as much as we love to know about the book that we're talking about. So for our viewers and listeners who haven't read the book yet and who may be discovering you as well for the very first time, do please take this opportunity to tell us just a little bit more about yourself. Like, for example, your cultural background, your education background, where you grew up, what you do for a living, and in fact, anything at all that you would like to share with us.
Sure. Yeah. My name is Mark Goodacre, and I am at Duke University in the United States of America. In fact, although the viewers can't see it, I'm looking out over some beautiful buildings at the moment through my window here in my office at Duke. And I've been here for 18 years. I teach religious studies. And my main area of concentration is New Testament, early Christianity. I'm interested in the historical Jesus. I'm interested in non-canonical gospels as well. And I'd encourage as well as people to subscribe to Book Cafe Podcast. I'd also, if I may, plug my own podcast, which is called NT Pod. NT Pod, and you can find that in all the same places that you can find Book Cafe. So, and I have about 103 episodes of that so far.
Wonderful. So Duke University, Professor. So if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Tim Cook, the current CEO of Apple, was also a graduate of Duke University. Is that correct? Yeah.
That's right. In fact, he did our commencement speech about 4 or 5 years ago. So we were all a little bit starstruck. I was particularly pleased to be, because I was one of the professors that processed in. I was very happy to be on the same stage as the great Tim Cook. But in fact, while he was here, at the same time, Melinda French, Bill Gates' wife, was here too. So she was also a computer whiz. So we have an amazing track record of computer geniuses at Duke.
Okay, awesome. And so let's just dive right into the book, Professor, after that preamble. So the synoptic problem, A Way Through the Maze. So there's a couple of things that we probably have to define first, because we're, after all, not just reaching out to people who have an interest in biblical studies and parabiblical studies, but also book lovers in general. So for their sake, would you mind just telling us very quickly, what exactly do we mean by the title of the book? What do we mean by the synoptic problem? And what exactly is the solution that we're proposing in the book?
Thanks. Yeah, it's the synoptic problem is quite easily explained as being the literary puzzle about how the first 3 gospels in the New Testament are related. So how are Matthew, Mark, and Luke related? Which one of them is the first? Did any of them use the other ones? Were there any lost documents that were shared between them? It's called synoptic because the syn bit means together and optic to do with the eyes, and it means you can view the 3 all together, 1, 2, 3. But John is different, so we put John to one side and on the back burner for now, and then we look at the 3 synoptic gospels. And the idea of my book, A Way Through the Maze, was to try and take a simple route that walks the reader through the maze as straightforwardly as they can, because it can seem very daunting and problematic at first. But actually, if you take it in stages, it's like any academic discipline. You don't just throw it on everyone all at once. If you go stage by stage, step by step, I think you can actually find a good solution to the problem. So I end the book with putting forward my own solution to the synoptic problem. Well, it's not, I didn't invent it, but the one that I propose, which is known as the Farah theory. And that's the theory that Matthew and Luke both used Mark's gospel. But in addition to that, Luke also had a copy of Matthew's gospel. That's known as the Farah theory.
Absolutely. And so Professor, as I understand it, based on what you've written in the book, and as well as doing my research for this episode, the Farrer hypothesis is only one of the possible solutions to the synoptic problems, right? So just to play a little bit of devil's advocate, would you mind also telling us what are some of the other solutions to the synoptic problem before we deep dive into the Farrer hypothesis itself? Yeah.
Sure. The solution to the synoptic problem that's been most common for, I would say, at least a century and maybe a little longer than a century is known as the two-source theory. And the two-source theory is essentially that Mark is the first gospel to have been written, and that Matthew and Luke both use Mark. But in addition to that, Matthew and Luke both also used a hypothetical document, which they label Q for convenience, because it doesn't actually physically exist anywhere as far as we know. And Q stands for Q is the first letter of the German word Quelle, which means source. So if you're doing it in English, you could call it S. Yep. So that's the two-source theory. And I think that the value of the two-source theory is it's really emphasized the importance of Mark and priority, the idea that Mark is the first gospel, and that's something that I strongly agree with. The bit I disagree with is the Q bit. But there's lots going for the two-source theory. It makes a lot of sense in all sorts of ways. And one of the things that it has done very successfully is helped us to see how Matthew's gospel was composed and how Luke's gospel were composed. Because if Mark is one of their major sources or their major source, you can actually see Mark on almost every page of their gospels. It just keeps showing its little presence up there. So I mean, that I think is fundamentally right about the two-source theory.
Absolutely. And if I could just for my knowledge, Professor, if I could just put in a number, if you take the entire the universe of biblical scholars who are in support of the two-source hypothesis versus the Farrer theory, what percentage would you put in each camp? If I could just throw that out there.
Yeah. It's difficult to say. I would say that because we haven't done a poll. Yeah. I think it would be fair to say that for most of the 20th century into the early 21st century, the two-source theory was absolutely dominant. So you'd be looking at 80 or 90% of scholars believed it. I think that that's eroded a bit in recent years. I would say over the last 10 or 20 years, I think there's been more skepticism about the two-source theory. Mark and priority, that aspect of it is still very much in the majority. And I think you could, if you want me to put a figure on that, I would say 90% of scholars believe in Mark and priority. But I think belief in the other tenet of the two-source theory, the Q bit, I think that has eroded a bit in recent years, that people have got more skeptical about the Q part of that equation.
And would it be fair to say that you have had a great big role to play in swaying people away from that theory towards the Farrer theory? Because that's pretty much what I think.
I couldn't possibly comment. I think it's fair to say when I started writing about the synoptic problem about 25 years ago, I felt so much in the minority. I felt so much in the margins that there were some people that thought I was absolutely crazy. Like the idea that you would try and take on something like the Q hypothesis. And I even had teachers that discouraged me from the idea of doing my doctoral work on this because they thought it would be too risky career-wise. So I didn't write my doctoral dissertation on Q, except tangentially I did, but I wrote it on something else. But I wrote this book, the one you mentioned, in 2001. And one of the reasons why I wanted to write that is that every single major textbook about the Synoptic Gospels or about the Synoptic Problem in particular advocated so strongly for the two-source theory that I just thought it would be a good idea to try and set out the alternative case. But at the same time, also to do something that none of those books did, which always annoyed me, because one of the things about if you want to get a good solution to any problem in life, you need to understand the problem first. So you don't begin with the solution, at least I don't think you should. I think you begin by setting out what the problem is. So in the way through the maze, what I did was I tried to set out the data as clearly as I could to lead the student through to see what the phenomena look like. Once you've got, and of course, that's never going to be completely neutral enterprise. I tried to make it as neutral as possible, but it's never going to be completely neutral and objective, but you try and do that as far as possible. And then when you set out the data, you can then build from the data, you understand the problem, and then you can work towards a solution. So that was really one of the reasons that I wrote that book. At the same time, I also had a website. I used to love, back in the 90s, hand coding web pages. I mean, they look kind of terrible by today's standards, but I used to enjoy the fun of putting HTML together. So the first website I created was called the case. Well, it was called A World Without Q, is what I called it, and then a few years later, I changed it to the Case Against Q website. But the idea was that that would also be another way to reach more people, especially students, to just try and put a question mark against the Q hypothesis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of which, Professor, obviously this book is not your first rodeo. You have, in fact, written a couple of other books as well. Would you mind just very quickly telling us the names of some of the other books that you've written?
Yeah, sure. The first book I wrote was my doctoral dissertation. It was called Goldar and the Gospels. Goldar as in shoulder. Goldar was a scholar, a British scholar who was famous for having advocated for this non-Q hypothesis. And that came out in 1996. And then Way Through the Maze came out in 2001, the one we're talking about. I then, at the same time that I was writing Way Through the Maze, I also wrote another book called The Case Against Q. And that's the one that probably has done most of what I've written to erode confidence in Q. Then in 2012, I wrote a book called Thomas and the Gospels, which is all about the Gospel of Thomas and the Gospel of Thomas's relationship to the Gospels. I'm still really interested in the Gospel of Thomas.
Right.
And I'm trying to finish a book on John's Gospel at the moment. And it's taking far too long because I've been involved with university administration too much. And I'm back to research and teaching again now. So hopefully that will help me to speed up on finishing that book.
Okay, absolutely. And we do wish you Godspeed with regards to that book, Professor, because obviously all of your fans and readers would be really looking forward to reading that book as well. And of course, we'll definitely have to have you back for another episode. But, I am getting a bit ahead of myself. So let's just come back to the synoptic problem. So, Professor, as you mentioned, the book did come out back in 2001, and we're now in 2023. Would you say that has there been any new developments since the publication of the book that you would probably go back and change if you had the opportunity to do so, or come up with a new edition for the book? Is there anything at all like that?
Yeah, I think, yes, I would actually love to produce a new edition of it. And I've thought about this quite often because it wouldn't take me too much work to do a revision. And I think there are things I would like to add. I would actually quite enjoy adding a whole chapter on John's use of the synoptics so that it actually reached out beyond just the synoptics. So it could be, more about gospel interrelations more broadly. I would also love to add a chapter on Thomas's knowledge of the synoptics, since when I wrote this book, I wasn't an expert on that, but I became more expert as the years went on. I would say also I've slightly changed my mind about how I would present some of the evidence. So I would definitely make a few adjustments here and there, and I would also like more illustrations. So in the book, I did put lots and lots and lots of little synopses of the Gospels, charts, bullet points, because I think that helps the reader to navigate through. But I'd like even more. I think I actually have a piece coming out, hopefully within the next year or so, called The Gospels in Synopsis. And that's going to be part of the Oxford Bible Commentary, the new Oxford Bible Commentary. And that's almost as long, that piece, as the whole book. It was like writing a fresh book. And it was the process of writing that piece that made me think, do you know what? I actually could go back and revise Way Through the Maze as well at some point. Maybe I'll do it for its 25th anniversary, because that would be 3 years' time. Maybe I should
Right.
do it then.
Okay, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And there's nothing better than having a big milestone to, go back and come up with a new edition. So yes, that's wonderful. So you mentioned the Gospel of Thomas a couple of times, Professor. So I think now is a good opportunity to deep dive a little bit more into that particular gospel. So as far as my knowledge goes, it is a sayings gospel. And but how does that relate to the synoptics, or does it relate to the synoptics at all in any way? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the Gospel of Thomas was pretty well known in antiquity. We see lots of early Christian writers writing about it, but it was lost for most of Christian history. People just stopped copying it after a certain point, and then it got lost. But it was rediscovered in the 20th century, well, very late 19th and up to the middle of the 20th century. 3 Greek fragments were found at Oxyrhynchus, and then a complete Coptic copy of the Gospel of Thomas was found in Nag Hammadi in Egypt in 1945. And it does seem to be as a sayings gospel in which Jesus is essentially a talking head. He simply says wise things. He gets questioned sometimes by his disciples or by other characters, and then he responds to that. And it doesn't have a narrative framework like the Synoptic Gospels and John. It's just very much individual sayings. And it's quite fascinating. It's quite an enigmatic piece, very mysterious. It's important for early Christian history because it does seem to be quite early. It must date from at least the middle of the 2nd century, and some people would put it even earlier than that. And it then raises, because there's so many parallels with the Synoptic Gospels, it raises a fascinating question. Could it be that the Gospel of Thomas knows the Synoptic Gospels? Does it use the Synoptics as sources? And scholarship has generally been divided on that. Some people think it's an early independent source. Other people think it did know the Synoptic Gospels. Well, I fall in that latter group. I think the Gospel of Thomas does know the Synoptic Gospels. And so my book, Thomas and the Gospels, was an attempt to argue through that and say, you can so often see in the way that Thomas phrases things, certain things that are characteristic of Matthew or of Luke. So quite often it takes over what I think of as Matthew's redaction of fingerprints and Luke's redaction of fingerprints. So Thomas, I think, does know the Synoptic Gospels, and that's one thing that I've argued. But it doesn't make it any less interesting for that. It actually makes it more interesting because it means you can actually see how it's working with some of its key source material.
Okay, absolutely. And and I'll just jump in here and talk a little bit about Saint Thomas and his journey to India. As you obviously know, Professor, that there's a huge Saint Thomas Christian community in Kerala, southern India, and
Yes.
that came as quite a surprise to me as well when I first learned about them. And so, I once had a chance to ask them that, how do you know that Saint Thomas really did come to India? And they're push back and say, do you have any proof that Peter ever went to Rome? So, and the question is, no, we don't. So these are
Yeah.
two equally valid traditions. So yes, I think that's absolutely fascinating, Professor. So, so as I
If I
understand,
may,
please go
if
ahead.
I may just pitch on that, I'm really interested in those Thomas traditions in India. Back in 2016, I did visit the sites in Chennai. I haven't actually checked out the sites in Kerala, but I mean, there's a lot of Thomas
Yep.
devotion, if that's the right word, in Chennai, and the connection with India certainly goes back to the 3rd century because the Acts of Thomas references India, and so I'm hoping to go back again at some point and do a bit more. If anyone is interested in my own thoughts on it, I did cover it in my podcast back in 2016, so I had a few sort of on the road episodes.
Okay.
And they're not just audio, but I recorded my thoughts about the Thomas sites I was in while I was walking around. So so that it is something of great interest to me.
Absolutely, absolutely, and of course, we'll definitely keep an eye out for your book on the sayings on the Gospel of Thomas, Professor. So I haven't had a chance to read it, but I definitely want to after talking to you about it. Okay, so coming back to the synoptic problem, Professor. Let's just backtrack a little bit and talk about the entire New Testament itself. So 27 books of the New Testament, 13 of which are the letters of Paul. Then we have the four Gospels, three of which are known as the Synoptics. Then we have the Gospel of John. We have the Acts of the Apostles, which is sometimes called the fifth Gospel. And then we have 10 other books, right? So to what extent can we say, Professor, that with regards to the Luke having making use of both Mark and Matthew, how confident can how much confidence can we place in the Ferrer hypothesis? And obviously, you've given a really good defense about it in the book. But if there was somebody who wanted to push back and say, no, it's just sort of if we get rid of Q, we're just simply taking problems from one bucket and then putting it onto another bucket. So what would be your response to the critics who say something like this?
Yeah, I mean, speaking for myself, I've always felt, I mean, I don't know whether this is a blessing or a curse, but I'm blessed with certainty on this. I'm absolutely convinced that Luke had a copy of something that looked like Matthew's gospel. Of course, lots of people don't agree with me on that. The reason why I think that Luke's use of Matthew works so much better than Q, well, there's lots of reasons, but one of them is that the degree of agreement between Luke and Matthew is surprisingly close. I mean, they are really, really close, especially in the material that they share with one another that's not in Mark, which is where you get the idea of Q from. And actually, I call this agreement too good to be Q, because if they were both copying from another source there, from Q, you would expect the agreement not to be quite as close as it is there. So that's quite telling. But equally, whenever you look at the material that they share, you can see things that are far more likely to be moving in the direction from Matthew to Luke than from some other direction, like Luke to Matthew or Q to Matthew and Luke. So you'll often find that Matthew's distinctive way of talking is present in Luke's gospel. One really famous one is, we still use this expression sometimes, perhaps facetiously in conversation, where we'll say, oh, ye of little faith, you of little faith. Right. That is a very Matthean way of talking. It comes 5 times in the gospel, never comes in Mark, and just once in Luke, where I would say Luke is taking it over from Matthew. And you find it in all sorts of other ways as well. If you look at John the Baptist's speech in Matthew 3 and Luke 3, the way that John the Baptist talks is the way that Jesus talks in Matthew's gospel. So he says things like, you brood of vipers, who warned you to escape from the coming wrath? Well, Matthew has a very, very similar way of speaking twice again in Jesus's mouth, once in chapter 12 and once in chapter 23. And he even uses in both cases that same extraordinary image, you brood of vipers, you snipers, it's like serpent's offspring, something like that. So yeah, so I think it's hard for the Q people because they actually have to explain why Q so often ends up looking a bit like Matthew. And really, I mean, there's this great thing called Occam's razor, great old philosophical principle that you don't multiply entities beyond what's necessary. Right. And my feeling really with Q is just we don't need it. We don't need Q to explain the agreements. It doesn't explain things better than Luke's use of Matthew does. In fact, I think it explains them worse, because you end up with a whole series of strange coincidences where Luke doesn't know Matthew, and yet at the same time he keeps doing the same stuff that Matthew's doing. So I think I mean, obviously I think I've got the better of the argument there, but obviously my Q colleagues don't agree with me on that, nor do the colleagues that think Matthew used Luke, and that's another important solution to the synoptic problem. That's one thing, incidentally, that I would change about the book. If I did a revised version, I would add more on the theory that Matthew knew Luke, and I would explain why I think it works better to see Luke's use of Matthew than Matthew's use of Luke.
Yeah, for sure. So just for my knowledge, Professor, do you feel that maybe there is a bit more vested interest in the two-source hypothesis simply because it's giving you more than one source, right? So historians always say that whenever you have multiple attestation. You can be more
Hmm.
confident about what you're doing. So if you get rid of if you get rid of Q, you're automatically getting rid of one source, and so you're left with a
Mm.
lower number of sources. So do you feel that maybe there's a lot more political motivation, or maybe that people are just afraid to let go of that two source because of that particular reason? What would be your take on
I
it?
think yeah, I mean, it's obviously always difficult to speculate on people's motivations. And I've noticed that whenever people speculate on my motivations, they usually get them wrong. So I'm hesitant to do that. But at the same time, I think I have experienced people saying to me that if you lose Q, you lose one of your most important sources for historical Jesus research. So I think it leads to some degree of anxiety, because if you read a lot of the major works of historical Jesus study over the last couple of generations, people have relied very heavily on Q. In other words, what they do is they say because Q predates Matthew and Luke, it's by definition an earlier source. And the earlier you get, the more likely the source is to have historical material. So that's one of the reasons people kind of hang on to Q, I think, because of that anxiety about losing something that's potentially key. But one of the responses I always want to make to that is, if you lose Q, you don't lose any actual data at all. I mean, all the stuff that scholars put in Q, all the stuff that they get pull out of Matthew and Luke and reconstruct as part of Q, that data is all there. It's not gone anywhere. So I actually think that historical Jesus study and other historical study becomes more interesting if there's no Q, because you can actually see more clearly the conversation that's going on between these early Christian works. I think watching the way that Luke is reacting, not just to Mark, but also to Matthew, becomes really, really interesting. Same, I would say, with John's knowledge of the synoptics. I think if John, as I'm arguing, knows the synoptics, you can actually almost see the conversation unfolding in front of you. And I think that's historically really exciting.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. And if I just may put in another question here, Professor. I just had it at the top of my head. Let me just think. I think it'll come to me. Okay, let me just go on to another question for now. If we were to put dates on all four Gospels, so historians are in agreement that the letters of Paul were written in the 50s. Mark was written in the year 70 AD. Where would you put Matthew and Luke? Would they be in the 80s and 90s, or somewhere far off
Yeah,
to the
I would
60s?
say, yeah, I mean, both Matthew and Luke have to post-date Mark. So, and if Mark is, and I'm sure Mark's written after 70. So and in fact, Matthew and Luke are even more clearly post 70 than Mark is, because they have these quite explicit references to what looks like the fall of Jerusalem, which happened in 70. So that means that Matthew has to have been written after 70. And really, you can't go too far into the second century for Matthew, because people start referring to it. And so it was already getting quite popular in the early to middle second century. And not long after that, you get papyri turning up, little pieces of Matthew's gospel. So I would be comfortable with Matthew dated somewhere in the 80s, but that it could just be a bit earlier. It could be a bit later. Luke's gospel, I think, has to be end of the first, early second century. In part, obviously, because I think he knows Matthew, but also a scholar called Steve Mason has made a very good case that Luke knows Josephus's Antiquities. Now, Josephus's Antiquities is written in the mid-90s.
Yeah.
So if you've got Luke showing knowledge of Josephus, that does push Luke post Josephus. And for what it's worth, you can't put Luke too late, because Ignatius, who's writing in the early to middle second century, seems to know both Matthew and Luke. His knowledge of Luke is really, really clear to me. I keep meaning to write it up, but I've never got round to it. But I do think that Ignatius shows that Luke was already around by the early to middle second century. So I think, broadly speaking, I mean, I always used to say Mark 70s, Matthew 80s, Luke 90s, John 100s, which is a nice, simple way of stacking it up.
Right.
But that might be a bit too convenient, and Luke might be a little bit later than that. So, but broadly speaking, we're looking at a span of time from 70 to about 120.
70 to 120. Okay, so a good 50
something
years.
like that.
Yeah, okay,
Yeah,
awesome.
that's for all of them. That's for all of them.
For all of them.
All
Okay.
four. John just could be a little bit later, but I don't
Mhm.
think so. Luke just could be, but I don't think so. I mean, these are all like judgment calls.
Okay. And I just remember the question that had slipped me just a couple of minutes back.
Mhm.
So, going with the fair hypothesis, Professor, which you've passionately defended, my next question would be why? What would motivate Luke to rewrite Matthew and make use of Mark? Given that,
Mhm.
if we assume that Matthew used Mark to make his gospel,
Mhm.
what would motivate somebody like Luke to do such a thing? So could you help us understand that? Yeah.
Sure. Yes. Great question. I mean, I my reconstruction, and this is obviously just a hypothesis, but my reconstruction would be that Luke has known Mark's gospel for some years and has heard it in church, has read it in church, has preached from it, gets it practically off by heart. Then he comes across somehow a copy of Matthew's gospel. And because he knows Mark so well, he can instantly see what Matthew's done with Mark. And he can see that what Matthew has essentially done is expanded Mark by adding birth narratives at the beginning, a resurrection story at the end, like full resurrection appearances at the end, and then in the middle, some new stories, but lots of new sayings material. And I think that what happened is Luke saw that and thought, I could do that too, and I could do it better. And the reason I think that he thinks he can do it better, obviously, like I say, speculating. The reason I think he thinks he can do it better is that he knows he's a good storyteller. Luke knows how to make sure that the story doesn't get too boring.
Mhm.
One of the things that writers will quite often do is they'll get bogged down in a particular section of their book, and they'll forget to add a bit of light and air and change gears a little bit. Luke's aware of that.
Right.
In Matthew's Gospel, the Sermon on the Mount goes on and on and on for pages, from the beginning of Matthew 5 all the way to Matthew 7. And it's just like this one long sermon, uninterrupted by anybody else saying a thing. It's just one dialogue all the way through from Jesus, monologue from Jesus. And I think Luke thinks this is so much good material there, but we need to break it up a bit. So what he does is in the case of the Sermon on the Mount, he moves it later in the narrative as well. It's far too early in Matthew's Gospel. So he moves it later in the narrative, drastically cuts down the length of it, keeps the sort of beginning bit, the Beatitudes, and the end bit, the wise and the foolish builders. And then he puts other sections of it at appropriate parts in his narrative. So there's a bit of Matthew 6, which is all about not worrying. Consider the birds of the air. They don't sow or reap or harvest into barns. And Luke places that later in the gospel when he's dealing with the topic of care and anxiety, and so on and so on. So I think that's what Luke thinks he can do. He's a gifted miniaturist anyway. Like Luke's parables are some of the most brilliantly told
Mhm.
in the New Testament.
Right.
Prodigal son, Good Samaritan, and so on. But he's more than just a miniaturist. He's able to write this plausible biographical narrative where there's movement all the time. Luke wants to keep the show going. He wants to keep the show moving. He doesn't want to slow it all down and stop like you do in Matthew's gospel. So I think that's what he's doing. I think he's trying to do what he sees Matthew doing, but he's trying to do it better, or at least doing it how he likes it. And that involves also pulling in lots of Matthew's new material, because I think he loves lots of that new material. And
Mhm.
also there's stuff of Matthew's that he doesn't care for.
Right.
There's this very strange story in Matthew 17 where Simon Peter asks Jesus whether they should pay the temple tax or not.
Right.
And Jesus tells him to go down to a fishing, go down to the fishing lake and get a fish, and then there'll be a coin in its mouth. And I don't think that Luke has as much time for that kind of story as he does for some of the other bits and pieces in Matthew that he does like. So
Yeah.
he keeps in the stuff he likes, and he dispenses with the stuff he doesn't like, and then he fills up the gospel with lots of new material that is more Lucan in style.
More Lucan instead, for sure, for sure. And if I could just jump in with a related question, Professor, with regards to Luke's motivation for rewriting Matthew. So as far as my knowledge of Matthew goes, I believe that it's a very pro-Jewish, pro-Israelite gospel, which seems to have a lot of focus and fixation on the Jewish law and keeping it, making sure that there's not a single dot or a tittle taken out. And do you feel that maybe Luke is the backlash to Matthew, and hence why that could be also a reason for his motivation to rewrite Matthew because he's more pro-Gentile? What would you make
I
of
think
that?
to some extent, yeah,
Yeah.
to some extent. I mean, Luke definitely has less. It has a less striking Jewish emphasis than Matthew. Matthew's Jesus, I think, goes some way to re-Judaizing Mark's
Right.
Jesus. I mean, Mark's Jesus is, even though he hangs out with Jews almost all the time in his gospel, there's still that orientation towards Gentiles in Mark. You get the sense that he wants to keep kind of reminding you that ultimately Jesus is going to be a Messiah for all the nations. And Matthew kind of reins that in a little bit, and his Jesus becomes more recognizably Jewish, if that makes sense. And yeah, the passage you mentioned is a really striking one. He says, "Not one jot, not one tittle will fall from the law until everything is
It's come
accomplished,"
to
whatever
pass.
that means.
Mhm.
But yeah, but so Luke then I think reorientates his gospel so that it's a little more Gentile facing than Matthew. But it has to be said at the same time that a lot of the material that Matthew has added that does look, kind of recognizably Jewish, Luke does retain. I mean, so he does have quite a lot of that material. And Luke has actually got a slightly different story to tell, because what Luke wants to do, I think, he wants to have his gospel devoted mainly to Jesus's Jewish followers. And then he wants to open things up to Gentiles in his second volume, Acts of the Apostles.
Yeah.
So I think part of what's going on in Luke is he's making that Jewish first and then to the Gentiles plan. And he's doing that quite explicitly, even to the extent where one of the stories he takes over from Matthew is the centurion's boy. I mean, sometimes called centurion's servant, but not entirely clear that he's a servant in Matthew. Well, that story in Matthew has a Gentile coming to Jesus in person and begging Jesus to heal his son or his boy. And in Luke's gospel, that story's still there. It's in Luke 7. But in Luke, the centurion doesn't come in person. He sends a delegation. So even there, you don't get a face-to-face meeting with a Gentile. And I think so. Luke is waiting until the second volume for the Gentiles. And in fact, he does have a Gentile centurion getting converted in Acts, and he's called Cornelius. So you do have this kind of reorienting in Luke's gospel.
Correct. Absolutely. And I think I had another related question to this particular point, but let me just skip through that because we should try and cover some other questions as well. So one thing that you mentioned in the book, Professor, if memory serves me right, is that although a lot of scholars are of the opinion that the earlier the sources, the better it is because it's probably more accurate. But you had a contrarian view about this in the book. Could you help us understand why that is and what made you come to this conclusion? Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose the thing is that, well, one of the reasons that people believe in Q is that they say that sometimes Matthew and sometimes Luke has the more original form of a saying.
Right.
And so they're sort of, you're kind of comparing what Matthew says and what Luke says. And so if it looks like one is sometimes more primitive than the other, then obviously that would be explained if they're both getting it from Q. And the difficulty about that is that it's kind of a judgment call about who's earlier. I mean, for example, there's one bit in Luke 17 where it talks about your faith being great enough to be able to tell a sycamore tree to be rooted up and to go into the sea. And the parallel in Matthew's gospel has a mountain. So faith can move mountains. Now, all the Q people think that the Lucan version is the more primitive. So they go for sycamore tree. So they say that's a good example of something that's more primitive. But faith moving mountains is something that already appears in Paul's epistles. In 1 Corinthians 13, you have faith that can move mountains. So there, where we can actually test it, it's the mountains that's earlier. And so much of the time where you're making those judgment calls, I think there's actually a bit of a problem about saying, Luke is definitely earlier here and so on. But equally, even if you could show beyond reasonable doubt that Luke occasionally has a more primitive version of something, that wouldn't necessarily show that he was reliant on Q for it, because we know from other things that sometimes somebody might rewrite the source, rewrite their source material in the light of other stuff that they know. An obvious example being something like the Lord's Prayer. If you've always prayed the Lord's Prayer in a particular way all of your life, and then you come across a literary version of the prayer which looks different, which do you go with? Do you go with the new version you've just found in the document you're looking at, or do you go with the one that you've known all your life and you've been praying all your life? So I think sometimes what Luke might be doing is he might be taking material that he sees in Matthew, but effectively overlaying it with something that he's picked up from tradition. I can't demonstrate that's the case, but I think that it's possible that happens. You can actually see something like it happening even when he uses Mark, because in the Eucharistic tradition, where Jesus has his Last Supper with the disciples, the Lucan version of the Eucharist looks a bit more like Paul's version in 1 Corinthians 11 than it looks like Mark's. So that would be a case of, we know if Markan Poet is right, which I think it is, we know that Luke knows Mark's gospel, and yet he's still relying there on Paul. So my sense is that it's quite likely that occasionally Luke might have overlaid whatever his tradition is with other things that he knew, but maybe not. I mean, some people are a little bit more single-minded and say, no, Luke's always secondary. I think most of the time he is, but every now and then not. Is that the kind of thing you're thinking of?
Yeah, I think that kind of explains, why you had written what you wrote in the book, Professor. But I will take your answer as it is. I'll probably have to think a little bit more about it as well. But I did find it fascinating that you would put that in the book, because we are also ingrained into thinking in one certain way. And what I really appreciated about your book is that you were not afraid to stand up for contrarian truths or contrarian viewpoints. And so that's what actually attracted me to the book in the first place, that you're making that contrarian stand. And I'm personally somebody who loves looking for, contrarian viewpoints and contrarian truths. So I think it's a discussion that we could have, and we could go on forever, but we'll definitely get back to that as well. So Professor, just before we run out of time, I just want to very quickly touch upon one more thing, which is how significant is the double volume that we have from Luke, the Gospel of Luke, as well as Acts of the Apostles, being written by the same author. How does that help us in dating where to fit in Luke and Acts, and how does it affect our understanding of the Gospels themselves? If you could just help us understand that a bit.
Sure. We're so lucky with Luke because we have got that second volume, and it's difficult to know. I mean, some scholars use that term Luke Acts as if they're one work in two parts. That doesn't need to be the case. I mean, one volume could have been written many years after the other. But one thing I would say is we are very lucky about having Acts of the Apostles, because it helps us to see what Luke is doing when he's dealing with other material. And you can see parallels in the two. And the way that he moves things around in the narrative is quite similar across the two. So, for example, in Acts chapter 9, just after Paul is converted on the road to Damascus, he goes straight to Jerusalem. And that's very similar to the way that Jesus, well, let me put some of this. That is something that Paul says didn't happen. In Galatians 1, he says that he didn't go to Jerusalem until 3 years later.
Right.
So we think, what's Luke doing there? And one of the things I think Luke is doing is he's pulled the story forward in the narrative, in the same way that in the gospel, he pulls forward the story of the rejection at Nazareth, which happens all the way in Mark chapter 6 and Matthew chapter 13. Luke pulls it all the way forward to chapter 4, so he can make it the definitive moment where Jesus can quote Isaiah and set out his stall, as it were. So quite often the things you see happening in Acts, you see similar things in the Gospel. So the two mutually inform one another, I think.
Right. And I think that's an interesting comparison you've made, Professor, with regards to what Paul says about himself and what Luke says about Paul in Acts. Just for my knowledge, are they usually in agreement, what Paul says about himself versus what Luke says, or is there some tension in between these two narratives, Professor?
There is tension. I mean, there are some very striking agreements between Acts of the Apostles and Paul's letters, but there's some really striking disagreements as well. So much so that people differ on whether Acts was written by a disciple of Paul's, like someone like the historical Luke that gets mentioned in Paul's letters, or whether it could just be someone from a later period who is kind of trying to depict Paul in a way that is got some correspondence with history, but some differences as well. I mean, it's a really interesting question. I mean, the difficulty is that if Luke, the later you put Luke, the less likely it becomes that he knew the historical Paul, and the more likely it becomes that this is something that is more kind of built up out of other materials.
Absolutely. And speaking of Paul, Professor, since we just mentioned him, there is one more question which nothing to do with the book, but it's just for my own knowledge, and that is, a lot of scholars are of the opinion that John has the highest Christology, right, and Mark has the lowest Christology. But as we all know, the letters of Paul did actually come out, during the 50s. And to my untrained eyes, it does seem to me as though Paul does have a high Christology. So how do we reconcile the two? I mean, do scholars ever think about this or talk about this as to how Paul, being
Yeah,
so early, could have such a high Christology? Yeah.
yeah. It's very interesting. I think. I mean, I too think Paul has a high Christology. I think Philippians 2 especially shows that. I think 1 Corinthians 8:6, where Paul appears to talk about God being one God using words that come from Deuteronomy 6, the Shema, and Jesus is kind of inserted into that. That's very high Christology, I think. The the thing, and I do also agree that John's Gospel has a very high Christology, higher than probably any of the others. But I think the problem with the way that some people do their history is that they think that history always moves in a straight line. So, you start off with Christology being low, and then it gradually gets higher and higher and higher and higher until you hit the sky.
Right.
And actually, history is not like history is more like that. So you could very easily have a Paul with a high Christology, and then you could have, say, Luke with a lower Christology, and then John with a high Christology. That's just life. I mean, as it happens, I think that the case for all four canonical Gospels having a fairly high Christology is there. I think even Mark's Gospel, it begins right off the bat with the words from Isaiah 40, prepare the way of the Lord.
Right.
And in context, that does seem to be talking about God, the God of the Old Testament, prepare the way of the Lord. And then it seems to be applied to Jesus, who is also called the Lord in Mark's Gospel, and even more in Luke's Gospel. Luke really leans into describing Jesus as the Lord, the Kyrios. So I think it's arguable that the Synoptics also have a high Christology, but just not as high as John's.
Okay, fair enough. And definitely that's really something to think about. So thank you so much for indulging me with that particular question, Professor.
Not at all.
Professor, just before we come to a close for this episode, there's something else that I wanted to ask, outside of the book, and that is that we've been very fortunate to have had a lot of critical historical Quranic scholars on the show. We've had, for example, Professor Dr. Gabriel Said Reynolds, Dr. Imran El-Badawi, and there are one or two scholars whose work actually overlaps with biblical studies as well. So I think Dr. Javad Hashmi is a very up and coming young scholar whose work, he loves to go back and forth between biblical and Quranic studies. Dr. David Penchansky is also somebody who comes to mind. And so my question would be that, some 20, 25 years back, I think it's very fair to say that Quranic studies was in a very nascent form. It wasn't as highly evolved as biblical studies, I suppose. But is there a lot more cross-pollination happening in this day and age? What would be your opinion on that?
It's a good question. It's beginning to happen, I think. I mean, here at Duke, we teach a course which we call Scripture, colon, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. And one of the things that we do is we do kind of comparative work. So, and that means sometimes looking at how the traditions differ and sometimes looking at how similar they are. So we look at what canon formations like in Judaism as compared to Christianity, as compared to Islam, what it means to translate your materials, what it means to study texts and manuscripts. And so we work through lots of those issues in a university setting where everything is open to question. And of course, Quranic scholarship has been in a different place than a lot of biblical scholarship for a while. I think there's obviously much less of the kind of historical, critical approach applied to the Quran than there is to Old Testament, New Testament, and so on. But I think that's changing, and I think it's changing because people will study these things in a university setting where the whole joy of being in the university setting is the conversation. It's like getting together with different colleagues and saying, "Oh, can you explain to me what this means?" Or "Can you explain how your tradition deals with this?" Or "Can you explain how this tradition deals with that?" So I think it is changing, yeah.
Okay, fantastic. So I'm really thrilled to hear that because these conversations between the two, the two traditions and the scholars talking to each other, and if you guys are all talking to each other, then we,
Mm-hmm.
the mass audience, will only benefit from the knowledge that gets passed around. Okay, so with that, Professor, I have to say that I've pretty much exhausted most of my questions with regards to the book and biblical and parabiblical studies. But just before we let you go, we do have a couple of staple questions regarding books, because we are, after all, a podcast about books. It's in the title. So
Mm-hmm.
with your permission, I would just like to ask you a couple of staple questions. So
Sure.
the first staple question is, are you more of a fiction person or a nonfiction person? What genre of books do you enjoy reading more? So, there we go.
I think I enjoy fiction much more, but unfortunately, I never seem to get the time to do it. So I think it might be something that when I'm retired, I'll get back to reading more fiction. And I think in the end, I consume more fiction through TV and film than I do through books, sadly. But no, that would be my go-to. And if I'm on vacation, I always read fiction.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. So that's really thrilling to hear. Okay, so the second staple question that we have, Professor, I have to first start by confessing that it's a question that a lot of our guests have said is a really tough question, but I'm hoping that you could give us a good answer to this one. And the question is, if you could select a book that you feel that every young person should read at least once in their lifetime, it may or may not be related to biblical studies, it may or may not be a fiction book, but if you could recommend something that could be useful or edifying, what would be that one
Mhm.
particular book that you feel that everybody should read at least once in their lifetime?
Gosh, that's a really tough one, isn't it? I see why your other guests are kind of challenged by that as well. I mean, one perhaps the easiest thing to answer would be if you've not actually read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There,
Right.
then those, because even though they're children's books and they're marketed at children and they were written for children, they are so richly rewarding. You can go back and read the Alice books over and over again and gain so much from them. So I think I might say the Alice books. Has any of your other guests said those?
No, no, they haven't, not yet. But I
Great.
find it very interesting. We've had a couple of guests who've mentioned a couple of fiction books, like David Penjansky, for example, is
Hmm.
extremely on the fiction side. So he said that I will read nonfiction for my research, but I would never read it for pleasure. And he was
Hmm.
so adamant about that that I kind
Hmm.
of got convinced. But for myself, obviously because I have guests from all over, all across the spectrum, fiction, nonfiction, I'm probably more bent towards the nonfiction aspect because
Hmm.
I treasure knowledge. But yes, I do agree with you that there's a lot of lessons to be learned, life lessons to be learned from reading fiction as well. Okay, so with that, Professor, I think that we can come to a very fantastic conclusion for this episode. So for our viewers and listeners who have been with us all this time, thank you very much for staying till the end. The book, once again, is The Synoptic Problem by Professor Dr. Mark Goodacre. It's a fantastic book written by a fantastic scholar, so do please go ahead and grab the book. By the way, Professor, this is an open source book, correct? So I just wanted to make sure I got
Yes.
that right. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so you can grab it for free. If you can just go along to my website at markgoodacre.org, or it's on archive.org as well.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's fantastic that it's open access because it's a fabulous read for anybody who's interested in critical historical studies or critical historical biblical studies. So I would definitely recommend it. It's a fabulous book. And Professor Dr. Mark Goodacre, my thanks to you again, sir. You've been a wonderful guest. I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I really hope to have you back on Book Cafe Podcast for a future episode whenever your new book comes out. So thank you once again for your time.
It's a pleasure. Thank you.